The puddle was still warm when they found it. I need you to understand what that means. February in western Pennsylvania, 1943. Everything frozen solid for weeks, the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache just breathing. But there in the snow beneath that white pine, a pool of brackish water steamed like someone had just poured it from a kettle. Frank Kowalski knelt beside it, pulled off his work glove and dipped his fingers in. The water was body temperature, maybe warmer. It smelled like sadness if sadness had a smell. Salt and something organic, something that had been crying for a very long time. That's what they found. That's all they found. But 30 seconds earlier, there had been something else. Something that made a sound so full of shame and misery that grown men stumbled backward into the snow and couldn't speak for the walk back to the mill. My name is Thomas McKenna. Everyone called me Red on account of my hair, though there's precious little of it left now. I'm 91 years old, and in all those years, I've never heard anything like the sound that creature made. I hope I never do again. 3 of us saw it that night: Frank Kowalski, Jimmy, Russo, and me. Frank's been dead 20 years. Jimmy drank himself into the ground by 1950, and toward the end he'd get agitated if you mentioned the war years, like something in those memories hurt him to touch. I'm the last one who knows what really happened in the pines behind the Allegheny plant on February 14th, 1943. The winter of '43 was brutal. Not just the cold, though that was bad enough. The war had taken most of the able-bodied men, shipped them across 2 oceans to fight Hitler and Tojo. The steel mills kept running because steel wins wars, but we were running on fumes and determination. Old men past their prime, boys too young to shave, and the handful of us in between who were too busted up or too essential to send overseas. Frank was 52, a millwright with knees that cracked like gunshots when he stood up. 30 years in the mills had bent his back and lined his face with soot that never quite washed clean. But his hands were steady, and he knew machinery the way a priest knows scripture. The night shift needed him, even if he moved like a man 20 years older. Jimmy Russo was 19, skinny as a fence post and eager to prove himself. He'd tried to enlist the day after Pearl Harbor, but a heart murmur kept him out of uniform. That rejection ate at him. He worked twice as hard as anyone else, like he could make up for not being in the Pacific by melting more steel in Pittsburgh. I was 26, old enough to have been drafted but exempted for essential work. My job was keeping the furnaces fed, making sure the fires never died. In wartime, a cold furnace was almost treason. The classification kept me out of France, but it didn't keep the shame away. Every letter from overseas, every casualty report in the papers felt like an accusation. The 3 of us had developed a routine during our dinner break. The mill was a furnace of heat and noise, men shouting over machinery, the air thick with smoke and metallic dust. We'd slip away from all that, out past the loading docks to where the pine woods began. There was a trail that the day shift had worn through the trees, just far enough from the plant that you could breathe clean air and remember what quiet sounded like. We'd smoke cigarettes and talk about anything except the war. Frank would tell stories about the old days, when the mills were smaller and the work was harder, but somehow more honest. Jimmy would complain about his girlfriend, who'd started writing letters to a soldier stationed in England. I mostly listened. The forest felt like the only honest place left in a world gone mad with killing. The trees were mostly white pine and hemlock, old growth that had somehow survived the lumber boom of the previous century. They stood straight and tall, their branches heavy with snow that muffled sound and made the world feel smaller, safer. When we walked among them with our flashlights, the beams would catch patches of bark and snow-laden boughs, creating small circles of yellow light in an ocean of winter darkness. February 14th was the coldest night of the month, the kind of cold that makes the air hurt going in and steams when you breathe out. We bundled up in work coats and wool scarves, but the chill still found its way through every gap, every loose button. Our feet crunched through snow that squeaked underfoot, packed hard as concrete by weeks of freezing weather. Frank lit his lucky strike with hands that shook slightly, whether from the cold or his advancing years. 28 below at the loading dock thermometer, he said. Haven't seen it this bad since 29. At least we're not sleeping in it, Jimmy said. He was trying to sound tough, but I could hear the longing in his voice. Part of him still wished he was shivering in a foxhole in Italy instead of staying warm in a Pennsylvania steel mill. I was about to respond when we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in that frozen forest, low and hitching, like someone trying to catch their breath between sobs. It came from deeper in the trees, beyond where the mill lights reached, where the darkness was complete. "Dog?" Frank asked, but he didn't sound convinced. "Wounded, maybe," Jimmy said. "Sounds hurt." We stood there listening. The sound came again. Definitely not a dog. Too rhythmic, too human, but wrong somehow. Like someone had taken the sound of weeping and stretched it, made it deeper and more resonant. There was an echo to it that didn't make sense in the open forest. "Could be someone from town," I said. "Lost hiker." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. Nobody hiked these woods in February. Nobody had reason to be out here except the mill workers, and we knew where all of them were. Jimmy stepped toward the sound. He'd always been the curious one, the type to poke at things better left alone. "We should check it out. If someone's hurt..." Frank grabbed his arm. "Hold on, son. Think about this. What kind of person comes out here on a night like this? What kind of person sits down in 28 below weather to have a cry?" Jimmy pulled free, but gently. He respected Frank too much for rudeness. Could be someone from the plant, someone who got bad news from overseas. That stopped us cold. Bad news from overseas. We all knew what that meant. The telegram from the War Department. The flag folded into a triangle. The knock on the door that every family with sons or husbands in uniform dreaded. "All right," Frank said quietly. "We take a look, but we stick together, and if anything feels wrong, we back out. Agreed?" We agreed. We pulled our flashlights from our coat pockets and checked the batteries. The beams cut through the darkness, creating bobbing circles of visibility as we walked deeper into the pines. Our breath steamed in the frigid air, and our boots crunched through snow that had been undisturbed since the last storm 3 days earlier. The sound continued, regular as breathing, but with a quality that made the hair on my neck stand up. There was something primal about it, something that spoke to parts of the brain that remembered when humans were prey animals, hiding from things with better teeth and sharper claws. 20 yards into the trees, Jimmy stopped. "Look at this," he whispered. He was pointing his flashlight at the snow. There were tracks. Not human tracks, not animal tracks like anything I'd ever seen. They were roughly foot-shaped, but broader, with what looked like claw marks at the front. The strange thing was how deep they were. Whatever made them was heavy, much heavier than the track size suggested. "Bear?" Frank asked, but he sounded doubtful. "Wrong shape," I said, "and bears are hibernating." "Not always," Jimmy said. "Sometimes they wake up, get hungry." But these weren't bear tracks either. Bears have 5 claws. These had 4, long and deep, like someone had dragged railroad spikes through the snow. The weeping sound came again, closer now. It was definitely coming from the direction the tracks led. We followed them, our flashlight beams dancing ahead of us, picking out individual pine needles in the crystalline structure of wind-blown snow. The forest seemed to close in around us as we walked. The trees grew thicker, their branches interlacing overhead to block out what little starlight made it through the cloud cover. Our lights became the only source of illumination, creating a small bubble of visibility that moved with us through the darkness. "There," Jimmy whispered. Ahead of us, maybe 30 feet away, was a massive white pine. It stood apart from the others, ancient and gnarled, its trunk easily 4 feet across. At its base, hunched against the bark like it was trying to melt into the tree itself, was something that shouldn't have existed. It was roughly the size of a man, but wrong in every proportion. The torso was too broad, the arms too long, the head too small for the body. Its skin, what we could see of it in the flashlight beam, was mottled and warted, hanging loose in places like an ill-fitting coat. The thing was covered in what looked like growths, bulbous protrusions that caught the light wetly. But the most disturbing thing was how it moved. Its shoulders heaved with each sob, the entire body shaking with what looked like genuine grief. Its face was turned away from us, pressed against the tree bark, but we could see tears running down its body in streams. Not just wetness on its cheeks, but actual rivulets of liquid running down its skin and dripping onto the snow beneath it. The ground under the creature was muddy. Not just damp, but actually muddy, with standing water that steamed in the frigid air. Everything else was frozen solid, but this patch of earth looked like it had just thawed, turned soft and dark by the constant flow of tears. We stood there watching for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. None of us moved. None of us spoke. The creature was so absorbed in its misery that it seemed unaware of our presence. It just sat there against that ancient pine, weeping with a sound that cut through the winter air like a physical thing. Jimmy's grandmother had told him stories when he was young. Tales from the old country about creatures that lived in the deep woods, things that were almost human but not quite. The squonk was one of them, she said, a thing so ugly, so ashamed of its own existence that it spent its days weeping in the forest. So ugly that if you ever caught one, it would dissolve into tears rather than let you look at it properly. Fairy tales, Jimmy had always said when she told those stories, just old superstitions from people who didn't know any better. But looking at that creature hunched against the pine tree, listening to its heartbroken sobs, Jimmy later told me he could hear his grandmother's voice in his memory. The squonk weeps for the sin of being born ugly in a beautiful world. The thing we were watching fit that description perfectly. Every line of its posture spoke of shame, of a creature that hated itself so completely that existence was agony. The way it pressed itself against the tree, trying to hide, trying to become invisible. The way its tears fell like rain, endless and inconsolable. Frank was the first to move. He shifted his weight, and his bad knee popped like a gunshot in the quiet forest. The sound echoed between the trees, sharp and sudden in the muffled winter air. The creature froze. Its sobbing stopped mid-breath. For a moment, the only sound was our own breathing and the distant hum of the steel mill behind us. Then, slowly, the thing turned its head. I caught a glimpse of one eye, bulbous and wet, like a frog's eye, but larger, more human. There was intelligence there, but also something else. Recognition, maybe, or fear. The eye fixed on our flashlight beams, and for a second I could swear the creature was looking directly at me. What happened next? I'll remember until the day I die. The creature opened what I can only assume was its mouth, though I never saw it clearly in the darkness, and released a sound that had no earthly business coming from any living thing. It was a wail. It was our, but not just any wail. This was the sound of every disappointment, every failure, every moment of self-loathing that had ever existed, compressed into a single note and launched into the winter night. It was the sound of a creature that knew it didn't belong in the world, that understood it was a mistake, an accident of nature that should never have been born. The sound hit us like a physical blow. Jimmy stumbled backward and nearly dropped his flashlight. Frank's cigarette fell from his lips into the snow with a soft hiss. I felt my knees go weak, not from fear exactly, but from the sheer emotional weight of what I was hearing. It was pure shame given voice, concentrated misery. The sound every ugly child makes when they first realize they're different, amplified until it could shatter glass. We all staggered backward, our flashlight beams swinging wildly. When we managed to steady them again and point them back at the tree, the creature was gone. In its place was a puddle of water, steaming in the snow like someone had poured it from a kettle. The muddy patch beneath the tree had grown larger, spreading out in all directions from where the creature had been sitting. The water was dark and brackish, with an organic smell that reminded me of tears and sadness. Frank was the first to approach it. His face was pale in the flashlight beam, but he walked forward with the careful determination of a man who'd spent his life dealing with things he didn't understand. He knelt beside the puddle and pulled off his work glove, dipping his fingers into the warm water. "Jesus," he whispered. "It's real. It's actually real." "Body temperature," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe warmer." Jimmy and I approached cautiously. The puddle was maybe 3 feet across, irregular in shape like water that had been poured out quickly. Steam rose from its surface in thin wisps that caught our flashlight beams. The snow around the edges was melting, creating a wider circle of dark, muddy ground. "It dissolved," Jimmy said, and there was wonder in his voice. Just like Nona said they would. The squonk dissolved into tears. Frank stood up slowly, his knees creaking in the cold. "Your grandmother's stories. She always said they were too ashamed to be captured, too ugly to let anyone see them properly. If you cornered one, it would just melt away." Jimmy played his flashlight beam across the steaming water. dissolve into nothing but salt water and sorrow. I knelt down and breathed in the smell rising from the puddle. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Salt, yes, but also something deeper, something that made my chest tight and my throat close up. It smelled like every time I'd ever cried alone in the dark, every moment of shame I'd carried since childhood. "We should head back," Frank said. "Shift ends in 20 minutes." But none of us moved. We stood there in the snow, 3 grown men staring at a puddle of warm water that shouldn't have existed. The impossibility of it was overwhelming. Everything we thought we knew about the world had just proven insufficient. The walk back to the mill passed in silence. Our flashlights carved paths through the darkness, but the forest felt different now. Less empty, like we were being watched by things that had always been there, waiting in the spaces between the trees for someone to finally notice them. When we reached the loading dock, Frank stopped and turned to us. "We don't talk about this, not to anyone, not ever." "But Frank," Jimmy started. "No," Frank's voice was firm. "You think anyone's going to believe us? You think the foreman wants to hear that his night crew is seeing monsters in the woods? We're already running on borrowed time here, son. Half the supervisors think we're too old or too young to be trusted with wartime production. Last thing we need is them thinking we're crazy too." Jimmy looked like he wanted to argue, but I could see Frank's point. The war had everyone on edge. Productivity was everything. Morale was critical. 3 steelworkers claiming they'd seen a fairy tale creature dissolve into tears wasn't going to help anyone's confidence in our mental state. "All right," Jimmy said finally, "we keep it between us." "Between us," I agreed. Frank nodded. "What happened out there, it's ours, nobody else's. We carry it, and we don't let it interfere with the work." We shook hands on it there in the loading dock, surrounded by stacks of steel beams destined for warships and bombers. Our breath steamed in the cold air, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley. But keeping silent about something doesn't make it go away. The next few weeks were the hardest of that brutal winter. The creature we'd seen had left its mark on all of us, though we showed it in different ways. Jimmy became withdrawn, barely speaking during our dinner breaks. When he did talk, it was about his grandmother's stories, the old folklore she'd brought from the mountains of Italy. He'd ask questions about other creatures, other legends, like he was trying to map out a world that suddenly included impossible things. Frank threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. He'd always been thorough, but now he was obsessive. Every bolt checked twice, every gauge read 3 times. It was like he was trying to prove to himself that machinery was still reliable, that the physical world still operated according to rules he could understand and trust. I found myself walking past the pine woods every day after my shift, not entering, just looking. The tree line seemed different in daylight, more ordinary. It was hard to believe that anything unusual had ever happened there. But when evening came and the shadows grew long, I could feel something watching from between the trees, waiting. About 3 weeks after the incident, Jimmy's behavior took a turn that worried us. He'd started staying after his shift ended, walking the perimeter of the mill property. When Frank and I asked him about it, he said he was looking for more tracks, more signs. He'd brought a camera from home, an old Kodak his father had left him, hoping to capture evidence. "Evidence for what?" Frank asked. "For next time," Jimmy said, "so we'll be ready." Frank and I exchanged looks. The boy was becoming obsessed, and obsession was dangerous in a place full of molten steel and heavy machinery. It was March 15th when Jimmy found the second puddle. He came running into the mill that night, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "It's back," he said, grabbing my arm. "Or another one. I found another puddle." Frank looked up from the gauge he was checking. "Where?" "About 100 yards north of where we saw the first one. Same thing. Warm water, steaming in the snow, but this one's bigger." Frank set down his tools with deliberate care. "Show us." We followed Jimmy out into the March night. The weather had warmed slightly, but there was still snow on the ground, still that bite in the air that made your lungs ache. Jimmy led us along the tree line to a spot where the pines grew closer to the mill buildings. The puddle was there, just as he'd described, larger than the first one, maybe 4 feet across, with that same organic smell rising from its surface. The snow around it had melted in a perfect circle, leaving dark earth that looked soft and recently thawed. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, human footprints, leading from the puddle toward the mill. Someone was here, I said. Frank knelt beside the tracks, studying them with his flashlight. These are fresh, maybe an hour old. But the puddle's still warm, Jimmy said. If someone dissolved here, how are their footprints walking away? None of us had an answer for that. We followed the tracks, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. They led us in a meandering path toward the main building, sometimes clear in the muddy patches, sometimes disappearing on harder ground, only to reappear yards later. The track stopped at the employee entrance, just stopped, like whoever had been walking had simply vanished at the door. Maybe they went inside, Jimmy suggested. Frank shook his head. Door's been locked since 6. Night security checks it every hour. No one's been through here. We stood there staring at the door, 3 men who thought we understood how the world worked, trying to make sense of evidence that suggested otherwise. The footprints were definitely human, adult-sized, wearing what looked like work boots, but they led from a puddle that suggested something had dissolved there, and they ended at a locked door that no one had opened. We need to check the personnel roster, Frank said finally, see if anyone's missing from the night shift. We spent the rest of that night quietly asking around, checking with supervisors, making sure everyone was accounted for. All present, no one missing, no one had left the building through the employee entrance. But Thomas Kowalski, who worked the number 3 furnace, mentioned something strange. Thought I saw someone I didn't recognize earlier, he said. Tall fellow, thin, looked sad, real sad. Asked me where the bathroom was, but when I pointed the way, he just walked off toward the loading dock instead. You didn't report it? Report what? Man looked like he belonged, had work clothes on, knew his way around. Figured he was new, maybe transferred from day shift. Frank and I found Jimmy by the loading dock doors, staring out at the forest. What are you thinking, son? Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. Then, what if they don't really dissolve? What if that's just part of it, part of what they are? Meaning what? Meaning what if the Squonk can be both, the creature in the forest and something that walks among us? What if the dissolving is just how they move from one state to another? It was a disturbing thought. The idea that the thing we'd seen crying against the pine tree could somehow reconstitute itself as something human-shaped, something that could walk through our workplace unrecognized, was the stuff of nightmares. But it would explain the footprints. It would explain the sad-looking stranger Thomas had seen. And it would mean that our encounter in February hadn't been an ending, but a beginning. Over the following weeks, there were more sightings. A melancholy figure seen near the furnaces who would vanish when approached. Puddles of warm water found in impossible places, like the top of machinery or in locked storage rooms. The smell of salt and sadness that would drift through the mill on the night shift, making grown men inexplicably weepy. Jimmy started keeping a journal, documenting every incident, every strange occurrence. He filled a composition notebook with dates and times, descriptions of puddles and sightings, sketches of the creature we'd seen. He became the unofficial chronicler of something that couldn't officially exist. Frank grew more skeptical as the incidents multiplied. Mass hysteria, he said one night in late March. One of us mentioned seeing something, and suddenly everyone's seeing things. It's like that radio show a few years back, the one about the Martians. People want to believe in something strange, something bigger than the war and the work and the endless winter. But I wasn't so sure. There was something too consistent about the reports, too specific. The same smell, the same temperature water, the same overwhelming sense of sadness that seemed to permeate the air wherever the puddles appeared. Then, in early April, Jimmy disappeared. He didn't show up for his shift on April 7th. That wasn't like him. Jimmy was the most reliable worker on the night crew, always early, never sick. When he didn't appear by midnight, Frank and I went to his boarding house. Mrs. Castellano, his landlady, met us at the door. He left yesterday evening, she said. Took his camera and a notebook, said he was going to get proof of something, didn't say what. We knew where he'd gone. Frank and I walked the tree line for hours that night, calling Jimmy's name, searching with flashlights and growing dread. We found his camera first, sitting on a tree stump about 50 yards into the woods. The film had been exposed, ruined by moisture. Beside it was his composition notebook, its pages warped and stained but still readable. The final entry was dated April 6th. Saw 3 of them tonight, not just one. They move like smoke between the trees, but they're solid when they want to be. I understand now what Nona meant about beauty and ugliness. They're not ugly because of how they look. They're ugly because they know what we are. They see all the things we hide, all the shame we carry, and they mirror it back at us. They're made of our own self-hatred given form. Tomorrow I'm going to follow them. I need to understand where they go during the day. I need to know if there's a way to help them, or maybe a way to help us. We found the puddle 20 yards from where his notebook had been. It was the largest one yet, easily 6 feet across, steaming in the April night. The smell was so strong it made our eyes water. Salt and sorrow and something else now. Something that reminded me of Jimmy's cheap aftershave and the hand-rolled cigarettes he smoked. Frank knelt beside the water and removed his glove. His finger came away wet and warm. "God damn it, Jimmy," he whispered. We reported him missing to the mill foreman, to the police, to anyone who would listen. They organized search parties, dragged the river, checked every boarding house and bar in 3 counties. Jimmy Russo had simply vanished, leaving behind only a ruined camera and a notebook full of impossible stories. The official conclusion was that he'd fallen through ice while walking along the riverbank. His body was never found, but that wasn't unusual in the spring melt. The Allegheny claimed men every year. Frank and I knew better, but knowing and proving are different things. The sightings continued through the summer of '43, though less frequently. Maybe the creature had what it came for. Maybe Jimmy had been the one it was waiting for all along. Or maybe they just went deeper into the woods, away from men who carried flashlights and asked too many questions. Frank retired in 1945 when the war ended, and the mill started hiring young men again. He moved to Florida, said he was tired of Pennsylvania winters. We exchanged Christmas cards for a few years, but we never talked about what happened in the pines. Some things are too heavy to carry in casual conversation. I kept working the night shift until 1968, when arthritis finally forced me to hang up my hard hat. 25 more years in that mill, and not once did I see another puddle, smell that particular combination of salt and sadness, or catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist moving between the trees. But I never stopped looking. Jimmy's notebook survived in my possession until about 10 years ago, when a house fire took most of my belongings. The pages had become fragile with age, the ink faded, but still readable. I'd reread his final entries sometimes, trying to understand what drove a 19-year-old boy to walk into the forest, chasing creatures that existed in the spaces between myth and reality. I think he was looking for meaning. The war had taken away his chance to be a hero, left him making steel while other men his age died on foreign beaches. Maybe the Squonk offered him something the mill never could, a purpose that was entirely his own, a mystery that belonged to him and no one else. Or maybe he just felt a kinship with something that spent its existence weeping for the sin of being born different. The mill closed in 1973. Economic changes, they said, foreign competition. The building stood empty for years before they finally tore it down and built a shopping center on the site. The pine woods are gone too, cleared for a housing development called Whispering Pines, though the only thing that whispers there now is the wind through suburban lawns. I'm 91 years old. My doctor says I have maybe 6 months, probably less. Lung cancer, 40 years of breathing steel dust and cigarette smoke. I've lived longer than I expected and seen more than I thought possible. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the air smells like rain, I think I hear that sound again. The wail we heard that February night in 1943. Pure shame given voice, concentrated misery echoing across the decades. But it's distant now, muffled by time and failing memory. It might just be the wind, or trains in the valley, or the sound of an old man's regrets keeping him awake. I don't know if the Squonk still lives in the forests of western Pennsylvania. The old woods are mostly gone, replaced by strip malls and subdivisions. Maybe the creatures moved deeper into the mountains, following the retreating wilderness. Maybe they dissolved into the tears of progress, melted away like everything else from that simpler time when men could still believe in things that defied explanation. Or maybe they're still out there, wearing different faces now, walking among us in forms we don't recognize. Maybe that overwhelming sadness you sometimes feel in crowded places, that inexplicable loneliness that hits you in the middle of busy streets, is just the squonk adapting to a world that no longer has deep forests for weeping. Jimmy's grandmother used to say that the squonk wept for the sin of being born ugly in a beautiful world, but I think she had it backward. I think the squonk weeps because it sees clearly, and clarity is a terrible burden. It sees all the ugliness we hide behind our masks of civilization, all the cruelty we dress up as necessity, all the beauty we destroy in the name of progress. Maybe the real sin isn't being ugly in a beautiful world. Maybe it's being beautiful in an ugly world and having to pretend otherwise. I never told this story while Frank was alive. It was his story too, and he'd chosen silence. But Frank's been gone 20 years now, and Jimmy's been gone 80. I'm the last one who remembers that February night in the pines, the last witness to something that probably shouldn't have existed but did. I'm not telling you this as a warning. The forests where it happened are gone. The mill is gone. The men who worked there are gone. What we saw that night was part of a world that no longer exists, and maybe that's for the best. I'm telling you because Jimmy Russo died trying to understand something that couldn't be understood, and he deserves to be remembered as more than just another missing person from the war years. Because Frank Kowalski carried this secret for 30 years and never once spoke of it, even when the weight of it bent his shoulders and lined his face with worry. Because 3 men witnessed something impossible one winter night, and truth matters, even when nobody believes it. The puddle was still warm when they found it. In all the years since, I've never been able to forget that detail. The absolute impossibility of warm water in 28 below weather, steaming in the snow like tears from something that understood sorrow better than any human ever could. Make of it what you will.